Okay.
It looks like we have a pretty nice full house here tonight.
We do.
Excellent. Welcome to everybody who's here for On the Rail, a conversation with Stephen Callahan and Rich DuMoulin about seamanship. I'm excited that you're all here. And I'd also like to remind folks to check the YRA website for upcoming events, including our spring meeting, which is coming up the afternoon of March 22nd. So hopefully that's on people's calendars as well. It looks like the room is filled up now, so let's kick this off on the rail with Rich and Steve. You guys are in for a treat tonight. I'd love for Rich and Steve, both of you, to briefly introduce yourselves. Right, I'll just say that each of you are well known for books. Steve for Adrift, which was made into a film that many people saw in the fall when we had it at FTC. His stories of 76 Days Lost at Sea. We're not going to recount that tonight because he's done that brilliantly in a film and a book. And Rich, you're really well known for this book, Safety at Sea. I have my copy here, and I reference it often, Seamanship, Leadership, and Safety at Sea Handbook by the Storm Trysail Club. But let me actually not talk anymore here, but let each of you introduce yourselves and how you came to sailing by very different routes, but have wound up in very similar places. Rich, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I just hate to tell Steve that my favorite movie was Animal House, not Adrift, but that's all right. Yeah. But yeah, I've had fun, Cindy, with you and me and Steve talking, getting to know each other. That in a way, Steve and I are both kids from the 60s, but we came up very different ways into sailing, in particular offshore sailing. And my first 10 years were sailing on a 32-foot gaff rig sloop built in 1914 out of Jamaica Bay on the South Shore, no engine on the boat. And it was my dad and his cronies from the first year of World War II when they manned the yachts that went offshore looking for U-boats. And then later, when that was disbanded, they went off on the North Atlantic convoys. And so I grew up hearing about all these stories. So I ended up in the Navy for a while, in the shipping business operating ships, and then getting into offshore sailing. Kind of all started there. But at age 10, my dad decided to get back into racing. He hadn't raced since winning Larchmont Race Week in 1941, which was kind of cool because I wanted it as a kid, and my son wanted it as a kid. So it's a fun thing in the family. And but he joined Knickerbocker Yacht Club, and we started commuting up to the North Shore where I joined their junior sailing program, and that kind of launched me into one design, eventually doing the overnight races with my dad and other friends of his. And because most of the America's Cup skippers were from Long Island Sound, me and Don Browning, who's somewhere here, and others got picked up to sail in 12 meters. So it kind of opened the world to us. And but my favorite has been offshore. And then late in life, at age 54, I got into double handing. First with Peter Rugg from Long Island Sound, then Chris Railing, and then Rich Wilson from our trip from Hong Kong. And Steven has a lot more of the shorthanded sailing than I do, particularly solo, which I have not done. And I always like having somebody on deck to keep a lookout when I'm trying to sleep. But let me throw it to you, Steve.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. My parents came from Appalachia and settled in Massachusetts. My father became an architect and loved the ocean and took me there from the time I was a baby. And I always loved the ocean. And but they had nothing to do with boats really. And but I was a Boy Scout, and I was pretty good at those kind of basic skills, reading maps and tying knots and all that kind of stuff. And my Boy Scout master asked me if I'd be interested in sailing. He was an Adams from the sort of John Adams family, a descendant, and he had grown up in yacht clubs. At the time, he wasn't in one, but he just had a little day sailor. And I sailed with him for years through my college years. We stepped up from a day sailor to a little camp cruiser, the O'Day Mariner, and from there to a Cal 25 that we would then sail kind of offshore, and finally I started basically really delving into boats by the time I was probably 16, 15, 16. It was my passion. And in fact, I wanted to build a sailing hydrofoil when I was in high school as a senior project, but I didn't have the money for it. So I taught myself celestial navigation instead. I was determined. I was very interested in boats from the beginning, sort of as a lifestyle. I was interested in the racing end because of the technology. And that got me into multi-hulls at a fairly early age. Back in the 60s, my after school job was helping to build this 41-foot trimaran, and I never looked back. And then after college, I built a 28-footer I lived on, and from there on, just sort of meandered my way through the boating world. I've done a lot of different parts of the boating world: design, teaching design, working as a writer and editor, especially at Cruising World, where I spent 4 years in the 90s and did all of the most of the special sections there. We did an annual safety at sea section at Cruising World. And
Callahan, Stephen Callahan, is that?
Yeah. Yeah. You guys are on here.
Would Edward, would you please mute your microphone? Thank you.
Anyway, and just kind of went from there. I was drawn to the shorthanded offshore racing scene as a very young sailor. Followed things like the All-Star at that time, and basically grew up through that period of it, starting out as a more of an individual adventure, and in transitioning to what we have today, which is a fully professional sport in France. And so I've covered races and all that kind of stuff, but I don't have the kind of racing experience that you folks do, especially around the buoys. And I know, looking back on my life, after doing a lot of offshore sailing and whatnot, that I would have really benefited from that kind of mentorship, as well as the wonderful Arthur Adams, who taught me how to sail.
Awesome. Thanks both of you for your sharing with us how you got into it. There's many different ways of getting into it. And we talked a little bit last night about how we might think about that in inviting others into our sport to keep it going and growing. But to kick it off, I'd love for you guys to each share, right? You spent your careers focused on sailing and seamanship. How do you define that? And how is that important even to casual racers and sailors?
You want to take it, Rich, or you want me to?
Well, I'll start out because I have a Funkin' Wagnall's definition
Okay, good.
of seamanship here, and I actually found it in a dictionary as the knowledge and skill as to how to navigate, operate, and maintain a ship. And those of you who've seen me at the Safety at Sea seminars, I usually put that up on the screen. But the seamanship, to me, is fundamental. And it's what a lot of people who are in boats actually don't really have a good foundation in, because they've skipped certain stages, either not being with the right people, not being at sea long enough, just not having the opportunity, skipping over to not knowing how to navigate, but just following a GPS chart plotter. So I think seamanship is not even around our sport. And that's what we're trying to fix in a way with safety at sea training, which since the Fastnet race in 1979 has proven to be pretty effective to bring people's game up. I think how to make it effective in reality as opposed to just in a classroom is the challenge. And that's, I think, where hands-on safety at sea comes, where practicing on your own boat comes. But seamanship takes time. And yet, if you have seamanship, you can kind of stay out of trouble and go to a lot of places that you otherwise wouldn't want to go to.
Recording in progress.
Let me bounce over to Steve, kind of your view on seamanship.
All right. Well, I thought about this a lot. Being an ex-philosophy major, it gets me into all kinds of conundrums trying to do something succinctly, because it's like defining art or something. You come up with a definition, and it's a little squidgy on the edges. But a couple of thoughts. One, one is often repeated is prepare for the worst and let the best take care of itself is a pretty good general advice about seamanship. I think I kind of, I guess, mimic the dictionary definition, having the preparation, knowledge, and experience to get from point A to point B across water in is at least as reasonable condition as those conditions would have allowed. Which doesn't mean, and the reason I say that is because I have books with incredible feats of seamanship, which were kind of failures, but in the end, they just did extraordinary things and got to the end of it, despite the fact that it was kind of a failed voyage in other respects.
You talked about that in sailing, a straight line between 2 points is not usually what actually happens. How did you phrase that?
Oh, there's no such. Well, the shortest distance between 2 points at sea is anything but a straight line, in my experience. you know,
So
Well,
in terms of the lessons that you've both learned, right? What lessons do you have from some of your offshore experiences that you think are really valuable to folks that might be doing more inshore sailing? And I'm thinking about the folks on the call who, maybe they've been doing day races or coastal cruising, and now they're thinking about doing, something a level up, a little bit more complicated. What do you want people to be thinking about before they go out there? If they're really leaning into this idea of seamanship and not just having it be what they're thinking about, but maybe as a skipper or an owner, but for their whole crew.
by the way, Cindy, maybe people could just put their hands up if they've gone offshore, like to or from Bermuda, racing or cruising, or some serious blue water. Put your hands up if you've done that. Okay, so probably a little majority have done that. That's very good.
Awesome. And please, people, put questions in the chat if you have them.
I mean, the biggest takeaway for me in sailing, I think you get it most by being offshore with, is it's all about the people you're with. And of course, you want to have a boat, the right boat that's prepared correctly. You want to have a good voyage plan and know when not to go. That's sometimes your most important decision. But if you have to pick one thing, it's the people you're with. And I think that's what makes it great when you're at sea, whether you're cruising or racing, whether it's around Long Island Regatta or Bermuda or something bigger, that if you pick the right people and you prepare together, that when things happen, more generally, you'll be able to deal with it and you'll have a better voyage, more likely to get where you're going, or if you have to change plans, arrive safely somewhere else. And so selecting the people is, to me, the most important thing. And maybe, Cindy, you could put up that wanted advertisement that some of you have seen, but I love to put up. And it has to do with Ernest Shackleton when he was trying to pick his crew to go to try to get to the South Pole in 1914. And his ship Endurance got crushed by the ice, and he managed to save all 28 people over a long uh, challenge of crossing the Weddell Sea and then converting one of the boats to one of the lifeboats to a sailcraft that they could use to go to South George Island and going back and finding his people. But he had a great wanted ad. Are you able to find it, Cindy?
It's in the chat.
Oh, it's in the chat. Okay.
Yep.
But it basically, he was great at picking people. And his interviews of the other 27 men with him at that time, he was looking for skills, a stability, and a sense of humor, and the kind of people that, if they had to be together for a long time, would find a way to work things out. And it worked that way. And so, if for any of us, when we're going to sea, of course, you want to have people who have knowledge, but it's got to go beyond knowledge. And until you've been on a boat with people, you can't be quite sure. So I think it means you've got to go out and what most of you do is go sailing with people, socialize with them, go overnight, take them on a vineyard race or block race. Maybe if they haven't gone offshore, have them help you bring your boat back from Bermuda. Or if you're the one who hasn't gone offshore, see if you can get a ride back from Bermuda yourself and build up to it. But having the confidence that the crew really can work together. Uh, but for new people to get an opportunity, it really kind of requires some new faces aboard. And that's where I know my dad's philosophy was always to bring somebody new back from Bermuda. And he always believed that you needed two uh, seasoned sailors for each one person who wasn't so seasoned. Because when the cockeye hits the fan and people start getting sick or injured or scared, uh, it takes extra people to handle the boat when some of the new ones might not be able to do it. So 2 to 1 was always my ratio. Four good people coming back from Bermuda, two with less experience. And I think it's a great way to get people into the sport. And there are people who would want to take you if you haven't yet done it. What
Hopefully
about you?
everybody's been able to see the ad in the chat. If you haven't, it says men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success.
I'm not suggesting you use that ad. You might not get a crew, but but it was fun. Steve, what about you?
Oh, I kind of echo the same sentiments. Of course, I don't know if there's more than two people on a boat, it starts feeling crowded to me. I've not done a lot of full crewed races except one from Cape Town to Boston. The most interesting thing about that race was exactly what you're talking about. It was the people. I was a little nervous getting on board with a dozen people or so, and wasn't really sure how I would do with it in those conditions. But I ended up actually really appreciating that race and what every individual could bring to the table. I had an old friend who was born with spina bifida and was not supposed to live
Wow.
adulthood. He ended up running a pilot boat out of Charlestown and having a little cutter that he single-handed when I met him. And he had a great saying. He says, I'll never climb Everest or be a rock star. The question is, what can you do? And that's really kind of an important question to everybody. Everybody can bring aboard their knowledge and somehow apply it, or their wisdom and vision in certain areas. When especially I've dealt with a lot of ocean survivors and other survivors over the years, known them and interviewed them, and survival experts. And I think one commonality in those kind of extreme conditions, which can be applied every day, is you have your goal in mind, but you don't focus too much on that. What you're focusing on are achievable steps. I've been at sea with people who even were in the Navy or thought that they had sailed around the buoy so much and they'd be fine. And then one guy, for example, you mentioned this, was horribly seasick to the point of where we weren't sure if he could be in danger from dehydration and so on. And it was a real quandary about what to do. And those were cases where people just got a little bit over their skis. I think I lucked out really in a way, the way that I was learning how to sail, in that my mentor and other people would allow me to kind of explore the edges of my envelope, but they were always there to keep me from total disaster.
Well, you mentioned Mount Everest there, and I'm just curious, how many of you folks on the call have done some serious hiking or mountain climbing, rock climbing,
Yeah.
hiking? Yeah, it doesn't have to be Everest. I kind of feel there's a lot of commonality between the mountain climbers and the sailors, particularly because outdoors, risk management is a big part of it, preparation, respect for the mountain, respect for the ocean. And of course, you look at, why do people go cross oceans or why do they climb mountains? I always like George Mallory from 1923, who was asked why he wanted to climb Everest, and he said, because it's there. And I think a lot of us going to sea like to do it because it's an adventure and it's different than the rest of the things we do. And you don't need to make it a real adventure, meaning things going wrong and off the rails, but just the fact you're going to sea, like explorers did years ago, parallel to explorers doing mountains or whatever. There's an excitement to going offshore. but with proper preparation, it should work out just fine and be very, very, very satisfying. Steve, you called, what was your reference to the, kind of the offshore, the wilderness? How do you put that?
Oh, I've always called the ocean the world's greatest wilderness. And in that way, I totally agree with you. I climbed mountains and stuff especially when I was a young man before I started doing a lot of sailing. And I've always found any wilderness environment has those commonalities that, you know, we get so used to being in society with people around us. Our car breaks down, we just park on the side and wait for help or whatever. But it's not like that. And there's great, I don't know, prizes, if you will, from entering into these spaces, but it's a different reality. You're just a part of a much larger connected reality, both through the crew itself into the wider environment. I look at sailing as kind of like you're almost like a conductor of wind, wave, and machine. It's sort of the brains of a beast, but that doesn't mean that you're in control. You're in kind of influence of your course, and you got to work with things the way they are. Another sort of principle is it doesn't matter what you want. Things are exactly what they are, and the sooner you can come to grips with that, the sooner you can figure out how do I not only survive this but thrive within this universe.
You mentioned when we were talking about your time on the raft that basically you got to tackle one thing at a time. You
Right.
can only deal with one problem at a time. And that's almost, I think that Matt Damon in the movie The Martian, where he's stuck on Mars, explains to the class at the end the same exact thing. You just take one problem at a time, then you go to the next one, you go to the next one, and
Right.
before you know it, you're beginning to resolve the problem. Uh, leadership, that's what leadership's about. And of course, Storm Tricycle Club, we push seamanship, we push leadership in our seminars and our written materials. Leadership meaning responsibility. So all of you guys who are skipper owner of a boat, uh, you're the leader de facto because it's your boat, even if you do rely on other people with their skills. But you're responsible, and that's what's the most important operative feature, that you're responsible to make sure all the preparations are done, you're prepared. Uh, I think, Steve, you mentioned about the crisis you plan for, the crisis, and then there's the other crisis that can still happen. But if you're planning and practicing for one, you're in better shape when the unexpected occurs.
Yeah.
And uh, now leadership, of course, goes both ways. And when we had our leadership seminar, we had Robin Knox Johnson there. He mentioned that if you're the leader, you have to ask yourself, do you trust the crew? If you're the crew, you have to ask yourself, do you trust the leader?
Mhm.
And what it really implies is that leadership kind of goes both ways. Responsibility goes both ways. A crew member needs to take responsibility, point out problems, and the leader has to be willing to listen and to do the right thing. Uh, we also had a guy named Eric Simonson, who was the leading guide for Mount Everest. He and the German climber were the ones who, Conrad Anker, I think, found Mallory's body on Everest. And Eric Simonson said that when he takes his team, the group who's paid to go to the summit of Everest, up to base camp at 17,000 feet, he watches their behavior. And do they accept advice from their mates? Do they offer help when the other people need it? And if he finds somebody who does not help the others and who does not accept advice, he will not take them to the summit. They just stay at the base camp.
Right.
And so it's some very interesting ways people approach this. Uh,
Yeah.
but how does leadership work when you're the only person on the boat, the only person in the raft?
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, we talked.
is any of this relevant?
Yeah, it is really. I mean, we talked about this a little bit before this call that even anybody who's read Adrift, one of the central themes in it is that we're even in command of the motley crew trapped within us. That you don't just feel one thing or think one thing, especially if a problem is complicated or inevitably involves compromise or the best solution you can find or whatever it is. in bailing out of the boat, I had a part of me was totally freaked out. A part of me was, like a little crybaby, and a part of me was kind of going along with all the kind of rehearsals I'd done in my head and dealing with what I needed to deal with. And that part of me was just really sad and torn up by this whole thing. And part of me was even amused. And as time went on, there was kind of my physical part had certain needs, my emotional part had certain needs, and my rational part, I call it sort of my Captain Bligh, would come in and kind of restore order, so to speak, because we're all living. As soon as we're in these wilderness environments, we're in isolated territory with limited resources in order to solve whatever problems we need to solve, and that can be routine stuff from navigation to something just hit the boat and I don't know, I've lost the rudder or whatever it is. I've probably broken pretty much everything there is to break on a boat at this point at one point in time, and you deal with it. But you often you have to discipline yourself in a way and recognize these contradictory sometimes, I don't know, feelings and I don't know, motivations. And with the crew, it's kind of the same way, really. It's just that you're doing with a number of people, and again, like, everybody there has something to contribute. And I want to echo something that you talked about in terms of mountain climbing. I'd find, you go offshore, you put your wallet away. What you were ashore is irrelevant. Who you are on the boat is the only thing that's relevant. And if somebody shirks their duties, shows up late for watch all the time and whatnot, they're not going to be a crew on my boat very long. So it's not about me. It's not totally about me. It's about the greater whole and how we can facilitate that.
Well, I mean, I'm kind of laughing when I think of what we do to practice for going offshore at our seminar. We all jump in the swimming pool and get into a life raft for about 5 minutes, realize how
Right.
uncomfortable it is. Then we've expanded it to what we call level 200 for those who've taken the regular hands-on safety at sea, where they go out on boats and launch a life raft and abandon ship into the raft and bounce around for half an hour, come ashore saying they didn't think they were going to last another 5 minutes. And then this year we're going to simulate the rescues in the Bermuda race where two boats sunk and they were able to evacuate into rafts and get picked up by other boats. So we're going to do that between two boats with one raft. And but all this just pales, with your 76 days. And not to drag you through it again, but could you ever imagine before it happened that you'd ever be able to deal with that? Right? You ever,
No, it's actually, well, we'll get into, we get into, stages of survival and stuff. And certainly my experience probably mirrors a lot of others. Um, no, a commonality I've found with other survivors of all kinds of things, avalanches and crashing into volcanoes and losing boats at sea and all of that, is when the early stage, especially if you've been able to kind of escape the immediate threat, the immediate crisis, is that there's a period of recoil, which is like, oh, now my whole life's been kind of flushed down the toilet. What do I do now? And I was well prepared. Again, this gets into preparation. From an early age, I read everything that I could find about being offshore and survival and stuff. From Robinson Crusoe, which is actually based on a true story, to Survive the Savage Seas by Dougal Robertson. I carried a survival manual he had. I knew in my head, again, this rational part of me knew in my head, it's possible. You might be able to pull this off. But all of my emotional self was totally devastated. And that's very common amongst survivors during that stage where it's like, it's just too overwhelming. And it takes a long time to focus on those achievable steps to add up to the goal. And it's really the same thing you do on a voyage. I mean, I find myself when I go off on a voyage, the first couple of days, I'm going like, why am I doing this? I gotta, drawers full of t-shirts and why am I doing this? But after a few days, I get into the rhythm of it and I wouldn't want to be anyplace else. So you got to give yourself a chance to adapt.
I guess three people come to mind when I think of going through crazy, long, uh, stressful situations. One is you. The other was Robin Knox Johnson, and I recommend to all of you guys, if you haven't read Voyage from Mad Men, it's a story of the 1968-69 Golden Globe around the world alone race. First around the lone race, 9 people start, one finishes, and it's just so dramatic and entertaining and interesting. And after 313 days at sea, the psychiatrists sat down with Robin Knox Johnson, and they figured they were going to come back with some remarkable comments. And the psychiatrist came out of the meeting and said, "My God, he's distressingly normal." And so distressing normal, if I ever had another show, I'd probably name it that.
Yeah.
But the other was Ned Schumann, who some of you might have known, he was a prisoner of war for 5 years in Vietnam with John McCain, and then came back and took over the Naval Academy sailing program as his last career move. And 5 years in Vietnam in the Hanoi Hilton, 1 year in solitary confinement, tortured, and there's no way you could tell that that guy went through it. I mean, only by shaking his hand and realizing his fingers weren't all operating right because of the torture. But how these people got through it, you got through it, and I think that probably more people could get through it than think they would. But being
Absolutely.
properly prepared mentally by having read about it all really would help because you know that you weren't the first one to be in this situation. And I have no idea how I'd respond, but I sure know I've done enough reading for it.
Yeah. Well, I've heard from an awful lot of people. I mean, it's quite a common comment that I get is, oh, I could never do that. And I was like, you have no idea what you can do until you know, you're
Yep.
you're put to it, and you have a choice. You always have a choice.
Yeah.
And sailing can be a really big struggle for some people, and
Yeah.
may not be for everybody. But I think it's an incredible opportunity for us to get in touch with and to witness things that we could only witness by going through it. There was a shorthanded sailor, Tom Donnelly, who did a bunch of Bermuda 1-2s. And I remember getting into Bermuda once, and we were around the bar, and Tom went to call his work and stuff like that. And he comes back and he goes, "They just don't get it. They think we're out here having fun." He said, "They have no idea that we're not doing it for fun." And that also brings to mind a comment you made before. Dodge Morgan had a great answer, I thought, when people asked him, well, why would you want to sail around the world nonstop? And he said, because it's different and difficult. There is, we all search for meaning in our lives. And I find the most fulfilling things may not be the most fun, but in the end, like, I don't know, I did the Bermuda 1-2, the rudder fell off, and I managed to I carried a spare rudder, as you have in your boats. And I managed to sit around for 24 hours trying to figure out how I could actually reset this thing. I got it reset and ended up in Bermuda sort of mid-fleet. Now, that wasn't a successful journey in a way, but it was very fulfilling for me to have dealt with the problem and gotten in.
Well, I always wanted to. John Browning, who's on this call, and I are competing to see who can get to Jim Mertz's record of 30 Bermuda races.
Right.
I was so serious about it, I decided when I was double handing Laura Ann in the Bermuda race that I wanted to have a spare rudder that would enable me to continue racing. So Jeff Udell built a carbon trunk between the cockpit floor and the bottom of the boat into which I could drop a spade rudder.
Yeah,
And
nice.
it was kind of cool. They could drop it in, but the bottom part could rotate and the top part would stay in the trunk to hold everything together. And the whole goal to me was I just want to make sure I can go to the destination. And
Right.
it was so much fun preparing the boat for that. Never had to really use it in anger. But in going offshore, thinking about all the bad things isn't a bad thing. It's good because you prepare. It's fun preparing. It's fun figuring out how you can solve all the problems. And then the more you work on that, the less likely it is to happen. But if it does, you're ready.
Yeah.
And that's part of the game and the fun of doing it. If you don't respect the ocean and just say, I'm going out there and nothing's going to happen, well, you're an idiot. And so I think that I see people nowadays being much more serious. There's opportunities to take the classes. Uh, we have a lot of people in our Safety Sea seminars. By the way, May 17th at SUNY in the Bronx. We have our next one, and anybody here who wants to go to it, you don't need to do it for racing. It's great for cruising too, or just for fun. That we see a lot of people doing it who aren't thinking I have to qualify for Bermuda race. About half our people are not thinking about Bermuda race, for example. But it's a great way to build up your foundation. Uh,
Yeah, Rich, you're talking, it's something that, I don't know, what you were talking brings to mind is that a big part of this, and it's kind of surrounding this whole thing, is realistic risk assessment.
yep.
And we know it's not a huge mystery that, rudders are vulnerable, rigs are vulnerable, leaks are common, and these kind of things. So it's pretty easy to actually address those things. Of course, with stripped out racing machines, sometimes you might not have everything you want, but if people are experienced, you can make do with
Yeah.
with incredible limited supplies.
Well, with the data from the last Sydney Hobart race, I think it was 32 withdrawals, that the biggest reason was mainsail damage. I think 7 or 8 boats
Right.
ripping out reefs, pulling out the luff slides, whatever it was mainsail damage. And then the second was broken or damaged head stays. And
Yeah.
third was steering. And so you look at what happens out at sea, and all these are ones that you can kind of prepare for through having your sails inspected, reinforcing it where the spreaders poke at the reef points, inspecting your head stay. I mean, all the steering gear, and none of it's a mystery, but it's interesting what causes it. And this year in the Bermuda race was unique, 2024 that is, because for the first time in history, 2 boats sunk uh, on the way to Bermuda and one sunk on the way home from Bermuda. So three
Goodness.
sinkings, and kind of set people back mentally, thinking that here we are today with boats sinking like that. But all were safely rescued, and they all credit it to safety at sea training and the good fortune that their competitor is not far away.
Right.
So,
I found, before I was in a life raft for real, and the 28-foot trimaran I was living on back in the 70s, we had a life raft. We had also prepared the boat, since capsize is the biggest ultimate risk to multi-hulls. We had ways of, accessing equipment from outside the hull, so we could cut a hole in the hull and all those kind of things. We also had a life raft, and we blew it up once. And the 4 of us got in it and looked at each other and said, "Boy, I hope we're never going to be in one of these things." What you talked about, doing this training, it's invaluable. I can't tell you how important that is, because if you've been in the life raft, even if it's in a pool, you got a leg up. You know what it feels like once you're in there. You know what it kind of smells like, and these kind of things. And that's really important. And so the more you can sort of play around with it, I actually think it's quite fun. I go to these training places and schools and things like that, and often with other professional trainers, and they have no interest in getting in the life raft. And me and my wife are in there. Oh yeah, let's go jump around in this thing for a little bit, and or try to get into a survival suit, what we used to call survival suits anyway, on your own. My wife's 5'2". You put her in a one size fits all, survival suit. She can't do it on her own, and she certainly can't do it in less than a minute. So it's really important to just go through those steps, and so you know what's going on.
yeah. How many people in this call actually been in a life raft, for practice or whatever?
That's pretty good.
How many have been in a life raft because you had to be? Anybody ever had to abandon ship? Nope.
Yeah. Well, you
Okay.
just certainly don't want to, because, ideally, I say, what you want when your boat goes down and you step up to the life raft, hopefully that will be the
Yep.
only way it happens, is you want something that fits in your breast pocket like a pack of cards, and you pull a ripcord and the QE2 inflates next to you. But because of weight restrictions and
Yep.
all the compromises that are absolutely inherent in developing a piece of equipment that's supposed to save your life in incredibly wide-ranging conditions, um, it's impossible. So there are all kinds of compromises in there, and there's compromise in everything in a boat and everything in survival equipment, and it's really good to get familiar with that and know what the thing's limitations are.
Now, there's only two reasons to get in a life raft. What are they?
Fun.
Fire and sinking. And somebody
Yeah.
said, no, there's a third reason, bad food, but I'm not sure about that one.
Yeah,
But
and that's important. That's important to note because back in the day, I remember a lot of multi-hull friends of mine. I'd always sit around and multi-hullers would argue with the monohullers and about this, what's the best thing and all of that. And multi-hullers would like, oh, I don't need a life raft. I can't sink. I might go capsize, but I can't sink. I say, yeah, what if the boat burns? And I actually knew somebody whose trimaran burned to the waterline and offshore. So,
well, when I sailed double with Rich Wilson from Hong Kong to New York, we're going down through the South China Sea. It was, second week of the trip. And I happened to lean over to the life raft and look at it. It hadn't been inspected for 8 years. And I turned to Rich. I said, well, Rich, I know why you can't get insurance for this boat. But I said, it's not inspected. He says, the boat is your life raft. And
right,
and he had capsized a prior trimaran off Cape Horn. So
right,
and that was his raft. But
yeah,
he hadn't thought about fire.
right, right.
But
They are very good life rafts. I wrote another book, which was the multi-hull side of the drift, if you will. Four guys, so a full crew, on a boat that was going from South Island, New Zealand to Tonga, and got out, got a big blow, got overturned, 40-footer, and the guys spent 4 months upside down in a half-flooded boat. And one reason I wanted to write that book was after 4 months adrift, they were in such good shape that at first they got welcome, but then all of a sudden everybody says, oh no, this is a hoax. This is a hoax. They can't possibly have survived 4 months on the boat. But they had so many advantages over a life raft, access to
yeah.
equipment and all kinds of things, shelter.
Wow. So now, in terms of, both of us have done shorthanded sailing. I know some of the people on this call, I've been out double handing against them. I know they have. Uh, and but I'm curious, what innovations or ideas or equipment or techniques have you come across in your solo and shorthanded sailing that you think are useful for people who either want a double hand or just have more fun cruising with their families, friends?
Um, yeah, I don't know. I actually like double handing. Most of this short-handed stuff I've done is more double handing because I like you. Actually like somebody up on deck, kind of looking around. Although we have a lot better systems now than back when I was active. Um, I look at things in part seamanship and safety by design. I've written all kinds of articles over the years about, crew protection and damage control and things like that. I mean, I advocated early on to have dedicated life raft lockers in a place in the boat, usually around the stern of the boat, so that you can deploy really easily, because if things are really going south, it is very difficult to manhandle a life raft, especially if you're shorthanded and you're in any kind of storm condition or even rough conditions. Um, Things like crew protection, because when I look at risks from the survival point, which is the the quickest routes to death are injury. So plan for injuries, deal with, I don't know, having first aid experience or training or something. and drowning in hypothermia, which can do in minutes, and then eventually worry about food and water. We often say that we need food, shelter, and clothing, but shelter and clothing are actually redundant, because what you need is insulation from the environment. And for sailors offshore, shorthanded especially, having an inside steering position, or at least really good dodgers, someplace where you can get out of the weather, especially if you do anything in the North Atlantic, which is my stomping grounds. And those sorts of things can be addressed in design so that your crew is the most rested, comfortable, and safe most of the time. They're not sitting out in really horrible weather and predisposed to hypothermia and those sorts of things. In terms of other things, it's all the stuff that came out of shorthanded offshore sailing. Good self-steering gear, so people can get a rest and still have the boat steer itself. And the navigation equipment we have, leading the way that deck layouts now really favor shorthanded sailing. Because let's face it, most people are shorthanded. They go out with their, a husband and a wife, or a couple, or maybe a couple and a kid, or something like that. I mean, we often sail shorthanded, and all these kinds of innovations, self-tailing winches, the sheet stoppers, the list goes on and on. These are all things that we can fit our boats out with, that if they aren't already, and be better prepared, so that it's easier to do the other tasks when emergencies arise. You know all this because your boat's fitted. You have a Express 37, I understand, and you fitted out with all this stuff.
Well, I remember I was convinced to try double handing by Bjorn Johnson, who can rest in peace now, but he was one in the year 1999 to convince me, because he had an Express 37 that he'd taken to Bermuda, that I should take mine to Bermuda double handed. And I spent 2 years working up to it. But the first investment I made was a really high quality, hydraulically powered autopilot that was mounted down below, not one of these tiller things. And that totally changed the way I enjoyed the boat, because I could go out with a family and have it, steer the boat up into the wind while I got the mainsail up, or free me to go down below and get some food for the kids, assuming nobody was around, no other boats. But the autopilot made a world of difference. And I just loved sailing with the autopilot, delivering the boat, lay back and have a cup of coffee, let it do the steering, look around, dial a course change into it manually. The autopilot changed how I used the boat, and it made it good for double handing. Now,
But I got a question for you though. In terms of that, I mean, we get very used to this gear, and we wanted to discuss this anyway. We get very used to this gear, but what happens when the electrics go out or whatever? I know that you know how to heave to a boat, and you know how to balance a boat, and probably get the boat to steer itself, and those sorts of things. And that's another part of seamanship, is planning that certain things are going to fail. Can you do without it?
Yeah.
Can you jury rig it?
That's the question I put in all my damage control articles. And for those who really want a shorthand sail, cruise, or race, I forget his name, but he put a book. He's from California. He put a book together called Single-Handed Sailing. And if anybody wants to, I can find it out and pass it back through Cindy. This is a nutcase of a guy. And the stuff he came up with is incredible. And for a backup autopilot, he uses just some rope and shock cord. It's about 3 feet of rope, 3 feet of shock cord, 3 feet of rope. You tie the ends of the rope on the port and starboard side, and you take the shock cord and just wrap it around the tiller a few times. And by just grabbing it and rotating your hand, you can move the tiller along the shock cord until the boat balances. But if she gets off course, just grab it, give a push, and the shock cord brings it back to where it was. And I mentioned that to Josh Reisberg. I don't think he's on the call, but in the Bermuda 1-2, he lost his steering and autopilot, and he had the shock cord rope on board. So it's really fun thinking, how can you back it up if you had a blackout on board, basically.
Yeah, there's actually a book I've got up here on the shelf, I think, Self-Steering Without a Wind Vane, or something like that goes through all these different systems. And they're fun to experiment with. this is something that I thought was sort of an irony of my life. I was always used to like go, go, go. You're always going, going, going. And a good friend of mine, Russell Brown, who is pretty well known. He's the only guy to have ever sailed a pro across the whole Pacific. And I was very flattered that he'd asked me to go with him as far as Tahiti, which I did. It was the most incredible voyage because it's a 37-foot, 2-ton ocean canoe, sort of traditional style canoe. And Russell he had a prior pro up here. He'd sail up here to Maine where people thought he was some kind of a space alien landed. And he's got this boat that's incredibly fast. And we would be out sailing it, and he would go, "Oh, well, let's park for lunch." And I go, "What? Park for lunch?" And he go up to behind this island or even the middle of the bay and just heave to for a little bit, settle things down, have a nice lunch. And it was wonderful. It was kind of eye-opening because it was like, no, we don't always have to be going someplace. And it's great practice about how to handle the boat. And sometimes you need to like you might be having to work on something or whatever, and you need these basic skills.
Well, I think the biggest expert on this call for heaving too is Dick York, who was demonstrated on his J46 plenty of times, and well, we found out in a Newport exercise testing man overboard drills 2 years ago, was every boat heaves to differently. And
Yes.
the real rule is you got to practice on your own boat and make sure you know what your boat likes for all these conditions. How to set
Yeah.
your storm sails, how to heave to. Uh,
Right.
do you ever dare lie a hull with no sails up, and things like that.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, that was some point I wanted to bring up during this talk is that, I don't know, I don't have the depth of experience that you do with certain individual boats, I'm sure. But I've sailed, literally hundreds of boats in my life, and I say everyone has its own personality.
Yeah.
And you try to figure that out. It takes a while to figure it out because it's the personality, how it reacts to different wave trains and different wind conditions and all those kinds of things. And I find it fascinating. It's wonderful. It's like getting to know a person.
Yep. I see on the call, I mean, we're talking about converting boats to shorthanded sailing and improving your boat. Uh, Adam Laurie, I know, Adam, you've been doing a lot on Soulmates to make her long distance cruising suitable. I'm just curious, what are some of the key things you did to what is really kind of extreme racing boat if you look at the rig and the hull and keel?
Well, one of the things that we did for comfort was to build tall cockpit coamings. And that way we kept the waves out of the cockpit and we had a comfortable place to sit when we were hanging out in the cockpit. And thanks to a suggestion of yours, we moved the running backstay terminals from the back of the doghouse on the deck to the transom. And that way, with a single reef in the big fractional main, we can tack and jibe under the runners. And therefore, with a single reef, we're a masthead boat. Uh, then we also put in a windlass and a crash bulkhead. We put a lot of storage space into the boat. And then we put, comfort things in like hot water and pressure water. And luckily, the boat came with a great autopilot, but we upgraded it with a new brains box. The boat's tiller steered, so we're ready to go there. We're using the frame for the emergency rudder right now to hold the Watt and C hydro generator. But if we have to, we can pull the pin out on that, put the cassette back in for the emergency rudder, and put the emergency rudder back in. What else have we done? There's plenty, and a lot of storage compartments.
And you put a big Dodger on, a really strong Dodger.
Yep.
Yeah.
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 I built a fiberglass, splashboard around the bottom to support the Dodger really well, and then break most of the waves as well to make the isinglass in the front smaller.
Yeah. And then I also saw Allison, if you're there, Allison Shea in the chat room. We missed it before. You said you were in a raft for real. Allison, you there?
Maybe not.
No. She might have left. But apparently somebody was in a raft for real here. So that's good. You know, one other thing we did on Laura Ann, we used to have a mainsail that went up, a bolt rope went up the slot in the mast, kind of like a small one design boat. And when John Browning, Adam, and I, and five others were on the Vineyard race in '06 in the Hurricane Ernesto, we had a big double reef in the main, but we couldn't dare risk bringing the rest of the main down because it would fly away in 50 knots of wind, 60 knots of wind. And uh, I did two adjustments after that. Butch Ulmer recommended a Tides Marine plastic track that basically is an extrusion of plastic that you slide up your luff slot in the mast, and then you put slides on the main, and you have a wonderful slide mechanism where the main just goes up and down and slides and can't blow away. And it's so friction free that we could even reef the boat when we're on a run with the main pressed against the spreaders. And if you guys know what it's like to try to pull the luff of the main down with the full main against the spreaders, we could do it with that setup. That was the other great improvement I found. And then we put a second track on the mainsail on the mast for the trysail, so we wouldn't have to pull the main out to get the trysail in. So I think just experience on the boat and being out in heavy weather and finding out what you don't have is really a big help.
Hey, Rich.
Yes, Adam.
One of the other things that I did, that I turned all of my winches into electric winches, but not by spending the money to put in electric winches. I got one of the electric winch handles, and that really makes a big difference when you're cruising. It just makes everything a lot easier. If we need to pull the dinghy out of the water, if we need to pull up the sails, you know, even just to sheet in the jib or whatever. But the big thing is, if somebody goes overboard, you can use that electric winch handle to pull them out of the water with the life sling.
Yeah, on a halyard. That's right. That's right. That's a big, big thing. And particularly for people going cruising, we're short of labor. And particularly when you're going cruising because you're retired and older and maybe you can't hoist your wife up. She sure as heck can't hoist you up. So the electric handle is a great idea. That's a great idea. Dick, I know you're on the call. You're the chair of U.S. Sailing Safety at Sea Committee. I'm wondering whether you want to throw anything in here. I see your face, Mr. York. Are you really there? Oh, he's playing possum. Cindy, what else do you want us to cover that we might have missed there?
Yeah, you've covered a ton. The one thing that we haven't covered at all is seamanship and technology. With so much reliance on electronics and safety gear, what are we missing as modern sailors in terms of some of the old arts of sailing, where we might be over relying on technology, specifically as we're thinking about what might be going on with NOAA and things like that. Data may not be as available as it was.
Yeah. I don't know. We kind of touched on this a little bit in terms of, you know, planning for failures or what can fail and that sort of thing. In my experience, the electronics in internal combustion engines are the least reliable. And so it's just a different way of sailing. I mean, a lot of the boats that I sailed offshore had no engines. So you just you kind of get into a totally different mindset about, you know, how do I deal with this, especially like going in and out of harbors and all these kinds of problems. It can be done, but it takes a different technique, but it's not a bad thing to have in your back pocket in case things go a little bit south. In terms of the, you know, electronics and things, we talk about that a little bit, about reliance on autopilots and GPS. I actually was in Australia. My wife and I were there for a couple of years. We were refitting a boat there, and we had to duck into this area that wasn't well charted. And we knew where we were, but it was all these shifting shoals everywhere. And it was quite dangerous. And it was also an area where the Navy operated. And the GPS went wacko. It suddenly jumped to like over 3/4 of a mile from where we were. And it was night. And I had to, you know, I got up and I like freaking out. It's like, oh my God, we should be in the breakers right now across the bay. And instead, I took all the bearings and said, no, we're right where we're supposed to be, and which was a relief. And then it jumped back several hours later. It jumped back to where it was supposed to be. So even GPS, as much as I love it, I don't completely trust it. And it's actually a kind of a neat exercise. And some people have done this in very long voyages where somebody keeps track of like the GPS positions, but somebody else, even if they're not doing celestial, at least does piloting to see how close they are to where that track is. It's a really good practice.
Yeah, you were actually in your story, 76 Days Adrift, you were actually quite close to where you thought you were.
Yeah, I wasn't bad considering the fact I was trying to take sights on the North Star with kind of a few pencils lashed together, and estimating current and speed and all those kinds of things. Yeah, it wasn't too bad. Slowly getting off more and more and more. But overall, I was pretty spot on in terms of the latitude, and that was just like really basic stuff about understanding the world you're in. I've studied the stars and stuff since I was a kid, and like I said, I taught myself celestial navigation when I was in high school, and that's the only way we could find our way around for decades. Reading the sky, reading the weather, all these kinds of things. They're subtle. In a way, they're kind of subtle things. They're not like, well, you should go out and buy a life raft, or you should buy a specific piece of gear. But in the end, I think they're way more important is understanding your environment, the capabilities of your boat. What do you do in certain circumstances?
Mm-hmm. There's
Yeah.
For those that might not have taken any piloting or kind of navigation classes, even celestial, Power Squadrons does a really nice job of training in there, and you don't have to do all the math because there's also some really good apps out there if you actually know what the readings are that you're taking off of your sextant and other things. So the math is fun if you want to try it, but check out Power Squadrons if you've not already. There was a question in the chat about safety at sea training. Other trainings you guys might recommend as people are kind of building their seamanship skills, other courses or preparation.
Well, I think that sailing is one of those unique activities where you can learn a heck of a lot by reading. So the first thing is just find the right books to read. And I know Steve had a bunch in mind. I had a bunch in mind. I think we agreed we can put a list together and you can post it on the website. There's also in that pamphlet, which you showed, it's going to be on the YRA website with a link to Storm Trisel. And in it, it has a lot of references also. So getting knowledge can be done by reading, but actually learning how to apply it requires, being on the boat. And the best thing you can do is, and everybody's on this call has enough sailing background to attend the seminar. And safety at sea seminar, in one day, you'll be in a raft, you'll fire a fire extinguisher, you shoot a rocket, you'll hold a hand flare, you'll do damage control, you'll learn how to swim in a swimming pool with an inflatable PFD. You'll go out and practice man overboard. And when, these hands-on safety sea things seminars are available, and it's a terrific thing to do. There's also the online course that U.S. Sailing has, 15 chapters, which has some strong chapters on things like hypothermia and medicine. They have a very weak chapter on man overboard, and I think that's why you want to go to a seminar. But these are ways to start, and they are available. Storm Trisel runs it every May. Meanwhile, Newport CCA runs them 3 or 4 times in the winter. There's other U.S. sailing seminars. They're the best. The whole curriculum there is terrific. Everybody should take one, and bring your spouse, bring your older kids, go as an entire crew, and you'll end up in the pool together in a life raft together. So it's there for you. Just to comment on the technology part is that it's what's most important is the seamanship and leadership, as we talked about. And making best use of the technology is great. But without the leadership and seamanship, the technology is useless. And the technology can get you in trouble. I mean, you've got charts and the vector charts, which is what most chart plotters have. You need to zoom in on whatever course you've laid out because when you're looking at the large scale, you may not see all the features. And you got to zoom in. There have been some famous groundings of sailboats and ships when they didn't zoom in to see islands appear, shoals appear.
Mm.
And
I got an anecdote about that too. Like sailing in the Pacific, and I've heard other sailors report this. It's like, well, this atoll isn't exactly where it's shown, that kind of thing. In the Marquesas, when we arrived in the Marquesas, where the GPS put us was, again, it was a distance from uh, from where we actually were. And if we have these charts, and most of them are marvelous, but in a lot of parts of the world, there, look at the datums. The datums for these charts sometimes go back literally to Captain Cook. And so that's what they're basing, positions of things on. And the GPS is incredibly accurate, but unfortunately, where things are plotted is not necessarily.
Yeah.
So everything has this kind of Achilles heel.
we're lucky that on Long Island Sound, the charts we have are really accurate compared to almost anywhere else you'll sail. And around Block Island, they're very accurate because I can't tell you how many around the island races my dad navigated by being on the 4 fathom line, figuring that the biggest rocks are about 15 foot. We drew sevens, that's 22. And as long as you're in 24 feet of water, you're okay. And we go around the island in the fog based on the fathometer. And he started a habit that I still have. Every time I look at a chart at the location, our location, I just always move my eyes over to the depth and check, does the depth that we're reading on the fathometer reasonably agree with where the boat's located on the chart?
Right.
It's a cross check, which could save you some nasty, nasty stuff. And sometimes if you've made a mistake in your navigation, uh, this will catch you. The other thing that I grew up learning to do is we plot a course, a route on the chart for either cruise or a race. And my dad would always have somebody else in the boat do it independently and see if they come up with the same uh, uh, courses and distances. So I think being paranoid is a great attribute for a navigator. If you get cocky about it, you're sure to screw up. And a great example of that was, for those who've been at Safety at Sea, you've seen this. 1912 was the famous Titanic. 2012 was another cruise ship going up on the rocks, the Costa Concordia in Italy, where they weren't taking care of they weren't carefully navigating. They were doing a close pass ashore to show off the the lights ashore to some of the people on board, captain's friends. Captain wasn't paying attention. They went up on the rocks. And who abandoned ship before his crew and passengers but the captain? He's now in jail. So, uh, just because you have GPS and technology, you got to apply the seamanship and leadership.
Well, and I'd
Right.
also add into that, just because we might have right of way as sailing vessels
Mhm.
doesn't mean everybody else is going to actually pay attention to that, especially at night. I've had a couple of fun encounters with that.
Yep.
Yeah, I once heard the Bahamian rule is the bigger boat got the right of way. And it's not a bad thing if you're in a tiny sailboat.
Yeah.
Back to the courses. Thanks, Adam, for putting the Storm Trisol Club hands on in there. I added the U.S. Sailing Safety at Sea courses in there. Another course that I'll toss in there, I found it in Bermuda Prep a couple years ago, looking for world sailing medical authorized courses. Backcountry Medical Guides has a great online course. They're in Washington. But they also do hands-on there with maritime medicine, and it really is specific to sailing and water-related injuries. And the hands-on stuff that they do is really outstanding because it's one thing to practice on a dummy on land, and it's another thing entirely to try to stabilize somebody who's in a pitching boat who's been injured. And then also thinking about what do you do when you are down, now you're really shorthanded because you've got somebody tending for somebody and somebody who's actually ill and who's trained, right? Because if the person that's ill is the one person that knows what's going on. And I just wanted to kind of hit on that really quickly, Rich and Steve, and anyone else that wants to talk about it. How do you teach other people, right? I loved what you just said, Rich, about navigators, right? Being paranoid and sharing it basically with other people. I know sometimes navigators are like, I got it. I'll tell you what you need to know when you need to know it. And that's not offering the redundancy that you're talking about here. That might really be the thing that you want to do to be safe.
Yeah. No, I think that if you have good communication on board, Navigator both accepts input and also provides information to the rest of the crew, you head off a lot of problems. I can't tell you the number of times in my sailing career where some crew pointed out, disturbed water where I didn't think there was any. I remember coming in from offshore in the days before GPS in the fog with a spinnaker up on a 54-foot heading for the Jersey shore. And my DR said that we were about 25 miles out. And one of my crew got to be very uncomfortable. And I said, "What's wrong, Scott?" And he said, "This is like California where I feel the rise and fall of the swell just before it gets to the beach." And I said,
Mm.
"Holy shit." So I went on deck and I turned on the fathometer, and there we were in about 25 feet of water. And our DR was way off, and because our log was way off. And we spun around and a few minutes later heard the breakers. And you think of all the times that you're kind of, in that case, I was in the Navy. My career was saved because somebody on board offered advice and I listened. And I think this, helping each other on the boat, whether it's navigating, cooking, steering, lookout, that really is what keeps boats out of trouble.
And that gets back to the whole idea of, everybody on the boat, we're all building, we're kind of building on our strengths and in trying to improve our weaknesses.
Yeah.
And it's a great opportunity if you have a good crew, that you have all these. I mean, for me, the greatest joy for me is I've been blessed to know a lot of really quite good sailors. So it's wonderful if I can, snag a sail with them, because I learned so much from just watching what they're doing and how they're doing it. And I think we all need to recognize that we all have that capability to foster knowledge in our crew.
Let me throw in a few quick comments on communication because that's a big topic nowadays. The Bermuda Race Committee had problems communicating with boats during the race. The boats not hearing the call, not having their sat phone on, turning down the volume on the VHF because it was waking up the off watch, all the kind of problems we all know are there. But discussions, a lot of people have been having discussions of all the different modes of communicating nowadays with Starlink and Iridium and all the spots and handheld devices. And the Coast Guard gets kind of upset when it hears a lot of this stuff because they basically say, look, your primary communication is VHF 16, or primary way of seeking aid and if you're offshore is the EPIRB. Uh, don't depend on non-emergency communications to get you get you help in an emergency. Your primary ones are still the ones the Coast Guard is monitoring. Having the access to all these others is great, but a VHF radio works for anybody within range. And in a Bermuda race, there's almost always somebody in range. Along the coast, there's always somebody in range. Uh, the Coast Guard, U.S. and Canadian, can hear VHF a much further distance than you can hear it yourself. So they'll hear you, even if you can't hear them sometimes. Uh, but realize that the VHF and your EPIRB are your primary ones, and everything else is great. Learn how to use it, and sometimes it saves people's lives. But don't forget the real ones. The other is that if you haven't got AIS on your boat, get it. Any boat that goes out there and has let's say an auxiliary engine, even if it's one of the small 25-footer, AIS costs a couple $100, and that way you know who else is out there uh, because they're sending their identification and location, speed, and course. They see your name and identification, speed, and course. So now when you try to communicate with each other, you know who you're calling. Nobody ever answers the VHF. If you identify yourself, well, I'm the boat at such and such, and if are you in my vicinity and do you see me? But if you call their name, the Buckley McAllister tug, they'll come right back to you. And so AIS is really important for, especially at night and in fog. Uh, Realize that not all other yachts have it, but all commercial vessels do. And the other benefit of AIS is if you're doing overnight races or offshore, a personal AIS beacon, size of a cigarette case, uh, will enable you in the water to transmit your location 3 or 4 miles to the boat you fell off of or some other boat. And Dick York, myself, and others, we practiced with it off Newport at night. And the AIS beacons were good for 3 to 4 miles. And we had our navigator bring us back next to the beacon. The navigator was down below, and she didn't know where the heck it was. And she brought us back one boat length from the beacon, which was tied to a tall boy buoy. So these are things that ought to be standard equipment. The AIS transmitter receiver hooked up to your chart plotter, and personal AIS beacons if you do an overnight or distance sailing.
Hey, Steve, I've got another question for you. We didn't talk about this in the last couple times we've chatted, but talk about your water stills when you were in the raft. How long did they last? And what do you want to say about people's preparations and things maybe going out of date and not working exactly the way you want them to?
Well, first of all, it's very hard to even find one now. These solar stills that I had. In fact, we searched high and low for months on the internet to find one for this documentary that was made of adrift. They were the ones I had were produced in World War II, and as far as I know, and I've talked to thousands probably of World War II veterans and whatnot, and read stories that reference them, and I've never found anybody to get one to work in the real environment. They've been So it's kind of irrelevant. You can read adrift the problems I had with them, how each one had its own personality, and how I actually got them to work. There were some other solar stills that had been available. I think I tested them all. The only one that was really effective was made by Gore, who makes Gore-Tex, but they stopped making them because there wasn't a large enough market. And that leaves us with these wonderful devices that we have, reverse osmosis pumps. And you can get little small ones that are weigh a couple of pounds, or you can get larger ones, like if you're on a boat with 8 people or something, you got a 6 or 8 person life raft. I get one of the bigger ones, and you just pump fresh water from seawater. Now, it's not like coming out of the faucet, but you can keep everybody alive. And like I say, I mean, in terms of if you're actually in a critical situation, like getting in a life raft, if somebody's critically injured, there's not much you're going to do about it. I mean, you can do a certain amount of stopping bleeding and things like that. But if people are hypothermic, you can deal with that with proper clothing and survival suits or immersion suits. There's all kinds of compromises there. Those are the things that can kill you in minutes. And then it's water, and water is a really difficult thing. If a shortage of water is really difficult. For me, it was more difficult to deal with than shortage of food. So I really highly recommend these pumps. They do work. The little ones, basically you stick the hose in your mouth and you pump enough for you, and then you hand it to the next person. And the bigger ones you can really get a fair amount of water from. Of course, all these have been motorized and so on, and are quite available for small boats now anyway.
I loved how you talked about those. And so if anyone hasn't read the book or seen the film, I highly recommend it. I've seen the film twice. I'll try to see if we can't get it to come back through this area, because I know we did sell it out at Fairfield Theater Company when we had it here locally in the fall. But the other thing that you talked about, Steve, was the fact that life rafts and solar stills aren't designed to last forever. And you started to see things breaking down. So
Sure.
we might think we're prepared because we got this thing that, as Rich was talking about, this hasn't been serviced in 8 years. Well, is it going to work? So That's just something that I wanted to kind of remind us.
Yeah.
We might have ticked it off the list, 2 or 3 or 6 years ago. But that doesn't mean that one, we know how it's going to work when we deploy it or
Right. Right. Especially things like the equipment and so on. There are all these, I mean, we could go on forever about life rafts. I've tested a lot of them, and, there are a lot of things that leave a bit to be desired in terms of equipment and how it's packed. I've seen, just batteries with old sea style batteries in flashlights that are, in a bag that if water gets in the raft, they turn into soup in a matter of minutes. I mean, it's really important to go through the kit that's packed in the raft and to have your own auxiliary kit with things like, EPIRB and water maker. I tend to divide them into two parts. It's like, what might I want in the raft, but I might also need on the boat in an emergency, and have that kind of a ditch kit, and then pack other stuff in the raft that's kind of your basic kit. So you make sure you have stuff. But it's next time that if you have a life raft and you get it inspected, have a look through that kit and see how it is. But yeah, nothing lasts forever. And and back then, of course, mine was a natural rubber raft and so on. But they're not really made to hang out for 2.5 months at sea. They're made for, most people are picked up within 48 hours, and that's the reality. And now all kinds of equipment is so much better. EPIRBs are much better. They, we only had the former version of EPIRBs that might send out a signal, but you didn't have an individual ID, as opposed to the newer EPIRBs. Handheld VHF radio, and at the time, basically were new inventions, and you could get them in a waterproof pouch. But that was kind of like a new thing. I came back and people said, well, what would you have? Well, I have a VHF radio, a handheld VHF radio, because I could see ships and nobody was answering me or seeing my flares. Stuff like that. So, yeah, nothing lasts forever, and it's a matter of keeping up with it.
What I like to put in the dish kit is a couple of 6 packs of Gatorade, because they come in very strong plastic containers. And when you finish with a Gatorade and whatever, and the electrolytes that are in them, then you've got containers to put rainwater in, or if you
All right.
can distill water. One of the problems being a raft is not having containers. And so the
Right. Absolutely.
Gatorade, and the other is have a couple of 1 gallon jugs of water tied together with a rope with a hook on the end. And if you have to go in the raft, you throw the jugs in the water and hook onto the raft with it. So you bring with yourself a bunch of gallons of water.
Yeah,
And
I actually recommend, I had 5 gallon jugs of water, and it's like I couldn't get them out of the boat before I got broken away from it. And it was like,
uh,
ooh, that's like 40 days of, well, at the time they were saying, a pint a day or something, you can survive on that. I don't know if that's true. I think it's a good deal more now, probably twice that, but still it's like at least 20 days of survival ration. So, yeah, and you're right. They're no good. Usually they're not good containers in rafts. So that's a good idea.
the other thought going offshore cruising or racing is with satellite communications. If you had a medical situation on board, you can get some very good advice over the sat phone, including sending photographs back and forth. And therefore, the medical kit on board should be a lot more serious than your capability using it. And my wife put mine together. She's a nurse, and if the drug enforcement guys came on board, I'd be sitting in jail right now. But we had everything in the kit, morphine, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea was that if we had some really terrible injury on board, and a doctor on the sat phone told us what to do and use, I wouldn't have hesitated to use it. But we weren't going to use it if we didn't have the doctor's advice. And the fact that you can get this advice uh, that you should carry pretty much, depending on your voyage length and also any specific health issues, overdo it on what you carry, realizing that you can get outside advice.
I'm conscious of our time. We're coming up on 8:25. It's been a relatively quiet group in terms of questions, right? We've got some big hitters here on the call tonight Who's got questions or maybe even from the audience, other pieces of advice as we think about seamanship that we haven't actually covered?
One of the changes I did to my boat was to replace the VHF cable in the rig with the LMR 400 cable, and it makes the VHF broadcast further, and it also works better with the AIS splitter so that you don't get the interference. And I think that's a really important thing to do.
I mean, it's really important to get the VHF antenna at the masthead because it'll look down at an AIS beacon on a man overboard and greatly increase the range of receiving the man overboard signal, not to mention signals from ships and other boats.
Thanks. Hey, Dick, I think you've got your hand up. You've got something to share?
Well,
You've got a lot to share, I'm sure.
This is the interesting quandary that I keep on hearing. The word that comes back time and time again tonight is seamanship. And how do I get seamanship? I was personally lucky enough to sail with a guy for a while. He was an old CCA member, and he had sailed with another guy who had zillions of miles offshore. And you can just learn from people like this and absorb it. But I'm a little concerned that the modern young sailor isn't doing that. They're looking at YouTube instead. But I guess both to Rich and Steve, how do we ensure that the newer, younger sailors are going to be able to get the kind of seamanship you guys have been talking about tonight?
Good question, because one thing that I look at stuff on YouTube on occasion, and sometimes I'm kind of shocked by young people who have what appear to be pretty large, expensive, newish or new boats, and they're out there sailing around, and I see them confront what would have been considered kind of normal problems, and it's very difficult for them or impossible. Again, it gets back to that thing of maybe we can sometimes over rely on our fancy equipment and things like that, and in being saved out of our situation. I'm not sure if that's anything new. For me, certainly, I was lucky to have somebody who was a really sort of an ideal mentor, and brought me up through things, and then being given small opportunities here and there to sail with people who knew a lot more than I did, and I picked up a lot from them. And as Rich mentioned before, you can get a lot from books, incredible things. I mean, for me, I wouldn't have gotten through the life raft experience probably if I hadn't read books like from Survive the Savage Seas or the Bailey's 119 Days Adrift, and all these other things. Even though I couldn't, my situation was unique and theirs were unique. Conceptually, they were really important in teaching me how to, kind of, how do you think about things? How do you approach problems? How do you invent things? Sort of become a bit of a MacGyver in the situation, which is part of seamanship to me. Learning how to fix things. I mean, people these days replace things; they don't fix things so much. But I live in the country; I've been fixing things my whole life, and so there's subtle ways, I think, besides the actual training and all those things that we've been talking about. Rich, I'm sure you have more pertinent ideas on this.
Well, they're not all mine necessarily, but the Storm Tricycle Club, and a lot of you on this call are members, and a lot of you have donated your time or boats. But we've got our own strategy as to both how to bring new people in the sport and how to give them some fundamental seamanship. And through our Safety at Sea program, it started as Junior Safety at Sea, so kids could be prepared for the Beach Point overnight race in the Long Island Sound. And every July during Washerman Race Week, Friday is dedicated to Junior Safety Sea Day, and 20 or so yacht clubs in Western Long Island Sound send their kids with their boats, or we supply them boats, and we do the Safety at Sea Day. We have the Adult Safety at Sea. We encourage the juniors to actually come to it. We have the Intercollegiate Offshore Regatta, which Adam started for Storm Tristle years ago, and we supply 50 big boats, 34 feet J 105s up to 50 footers for over 50 colleges for free for them, not for us, but volunteer coaches in each boat. And then we started the Storm Tristle Foundation to support all these activities. And we started raising enough extra money to do grants. And we decided that yacht clubs don't really need any further help from us. I mean, we're already supplying seminars and coaches and stuff like that. But that there's yacht clubs, as Steve indicated before, people come into sailing from other sources than yacht clubs. And if we depend only on yacht clubs, we're going to really curtail the growth of our sport. And therefore, we're now up to $60,000 a year of grants to 15 different community sailing organizations, which includes 5 Sea Scout ships in Chicago, Texas, New York, Connecticut, and 11 community sailing facilities. The idea being that this enables people who don't have access to clubs or who don't have the financial resources to get into sailing. And once we get them in, we try to make available our seminars and events for them. But I think that it's both attracting. Our goal is to attract people into the sport, but also give them fundamental seamanship training along the way, so they build up confidence and actually get interested in it. The kids led the way. It was the kids going out on boats in a hands-on style that led us to introduce hands-on for adults. We saw how effective it was. At one point, the kids were better than the adults because they were doing hands-on.
I'll one more from the Yacht Racing Association of Long Island Sound. We actually have the Youth Challenge Cup, and there's a couple of other folks on the call that might have more details on this than I do, but there's certain races that if you actually register your boat as being a Youth Challenge Cup entry, we'll have a look at the number of juniors you've got on your crew, and you're eligible for a different level of different trophies at the end of the year. And that's our way of encouraging all of us to invite some new people and younger people onto the boats. Dick, you wanted to add something else?
I need to talk. Yes. No, the Youth Challenge Cup is great. And I know that a lot of other clubs other than, I'm familiar with Larchmont, of course, but a lot of other clubs too have a J105 or something like that the youth sail on, and those enter the races, as you said. The other neat thing that's happening, and this kind of thing that I think was great because it goes from just kids sailing together on a boat to mentoring. Things like the Block Island race, Storm Tristle, says that if you bring a junior aboard, we won't count that person in the weight limit. And we won't count that in other words, it's a free body. Depending upon how good the junior is, it may or may not be beneficial. But anyway, that gives the opportunity for doing what Steve's talking about, which is a mentor, somebody from Storm Tristle, taking a kid around Block Island race for the first time, getting stuck in tides and things like that. They're going to learn a lot.
Absolutely. Bob and Cynthia, did you have anything you wanted to add relative to what we're doing with the YRA to support youth sailing or other folks joining? And if not, that's okay. There was one more question. I'm conscious of our time. There's one more question in the chat that came through about emergency bilge pumps.
Okay, I'll have one comment to make about that. The old adage, there's no such bilge pump as a scared man with a bucket, is absolute rubbish. And I proved it. We did quite a detailed study of a whole wide range of bilge pumps when I was working at Cruising World. And these are all hand pumps now, I should say. I mean, you can have comments about all the other kind of pumps that are out there, but not relying on electricity. I think, you got to have some kind of manual pumps. And so what we did was, both my wife and I, we did an experiment where we used a bucket to fill up water. And we didn't even do it like going from below up through a companionway into the cockpit or anything like that. It was fancy. It just measurement into a bucket. And I tell you, I could put a lot of water into that bucket for about 30 seconds to a minute. And then it slowed down real fast. And if I had a good Edison hand pump or any other really good, even a very modest pump over a few minute period would outpace a bucket. Mm-hmm. So definitely got to have bilge pumps. Now, Rich, you can take it from there.
Well, I would just add to it that when you're shorthanded sailing, one person, two person, even three or four, that if you're in a position where your boat's sinking, you've got to be sending a distress call. You've got to be getting the life raft ready, your sails down. There's nobody available to pump. And you're relying on what Adam's showing here in the chat room. You need to have the biggest damn powerful electric bilge pump that's already hooked up. All you got to do is throw a switch. You can get the big portable dewatering pumps, but I think having at least one huge installed electric pump. And the moment you start leaking, you turn your engine on to keep your batteries charged, get that pump revved up, and that's buying you time as you try to find the leak and eventually decide whether you have to abandon it or not. And
I'll echo that and add, though, make sure that you've got screens on your intakes and stuff like that, and your bilges aren't all full of junk.
This goes back to my old man again. I can tell you that he was always in the bilge cleaning things, and I grew up having to clean out all the limber holes in the bilge. Yeah. And sure enough, pumps jam up if you don't keep your boat really clean under the floorboards.
Yeah, we did a delivery of a brand new boat, very high-end boat that will go unnamed, to Bermuda late fall. It's very stormy, and a couple of my mates spent half their time with their heads down in the bilges, clearing out wood chips and all kinds of clutter and bits of tape and all kinds of junk that was in this brand new boat. Nobody bothered to clean it out beforehand. So,
yep. Well, one thing that came up in this Bermuda race in the reports, which the CCA has just put out to the public, is that the boats that were sinking took a long time to sink. And in effect, these people were not stepping up into the life raft. However, when a rescuer comes by, you've got a choice: either accept that rescue or wait for the next one to come along, and they may not, or conditions could deteriorate and then you'd have a hard time getting off. Right. So when there's rescue available and you're sinking, you got to make a decision to protect your crew. If you're alone and there's no rescuer there, you want to wait as long as possible because you'd rather be on the boat than in the pump. Than in the raft. But electric pumps and having the engine and batteries above the water line, at least your normal water line, keeping your batteries charged up well enough, having backup pumps, all that's the preparation, and then trying to find the leak. And if you can find it, you want to make sure you heel the boat over the other way so it gets to be out of the water or less deep in the water. And their books written on damage control, which are really good to read.
Minimizing intake. I know we always had water resistant compartments as well as water tight compartments, especially in smaller boats. You can make water resistant compartments that, okay, maybe some water's coming out of there, but it's not coming out in a torrent.
Yeah. The scarier one is a fire. And if you don't control the fire quickly, the old rule is it doubles every minute. And it's an immediate threat to life. So having adequate number of fire extinguishers in strategic locations, knowing you don't fight a fire wearing foul weather gear because it'll melt against your skin in the heat, that all the stuff we teach in the seminars.
And fire blankets as well.
Fire blankets are great. And if it's a small fire, that should be your first attempt
Yeah.
because fire extinguishers create an awful mess down below.
Yeah, I actually have I don't know, it's not a question, comment, or whatever. I remember Hal Roth. I don't know if you ever knew Hal Roth, but he used to in the galley in rough conditions, especially, would always have bib foul weather uh, uh, pants on for the reason that there are a lot of scalding accidents on board in the galley and whatnot. And you have to be very careful with hot waters. And he always figured, well, if something jumps off the stove here, I won't get burned.
Yep.
So
Well,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Rich.
I remember my dad throwing a bucket of water on the stove on our boat on the way to Bermuda because John Browning lit the stove on fire with all the fat from the steak and managed to put out the fire and save the steak. Right, John?
John, are you
you're
going to comment?
You're on mute, John.
I'm no longer on mute, and not much of that story is true.
The
Well,
whole
we're
story is
sailors,
true.
and that's how it goes, right?
Well, that's when God was talking to you through a burning stove and we had wind with
The
it.
true story is better. We don't have time tonight, unfortunately.
I'm just seeing if John's awake.
Well,
Okay.
on that note, I just wanted to say thank you again on behalf of YRA LAS for having this conversation with us. Seamanship, I know, is important to Storm Tristle. I'm a member there too. And Rich, you didn't mention, I don't think, the new Burgee Award for seamanship. So we're all really paying attention to this, and I really appreciate, and I know everybody on the call does, everything that you guys shared, Rich and Steve, tonight. Final thoughts, parting thoughts, and it may be to Dick's question earlier. What's your advice to somebody who may be not so salty as the folks that are on this call tonight? What's your advice to the folks that we're trying to lift up in terms of growing in their seamanship?
I would just say, hitch a ride with a really good sailor with a good boat. And that means, doing some local sailing, maybe a little bit of maintenance work with them. And if you're not yet ready to do a Bermuda race or a block race, help deliver a boat. But most of you guys already have this experience. But I think building up to it is just a great adventure and a lot of fun. Steve?
I can only echo that. I think it's take your time, take it in achievable steps, and go for it. Hang out in the docks and chat with people and see if you can get a ride.
Yeah. And for all you people, most of you are in the position to give other people rides. So try to do that.
Yeah, patience for those of us who might have grown up in Appalachia or Pennsylvania, where we don't have a lot of ocean sailing. It's super helpful to have people who are generous and kind and patient in showing us, kind of what you see and why you're doing what you're doing. So thank you, everybody. I don't know that we're in necessarily a great hurry to run off, but for purposes of signing off for the webinar, we'll maybe stop the recording here in a minute. But a big reminder again for everyone to please, if you've not renewed your membership with YRA for this season, please do and do join us for the spring meeting the afternoon of March 22nd. We'll look forward to hearing you or seeing you there, and also having a fun conversation about PHRF as well. So thanks again, everybody. And I hope you have a great evening, and looking forward to seeing you out there on the water soon.
Thanks, Cindy.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Dave.
Yep. Keep her on the road.
Bye-bye, guys.
Thank you.